Autumn 1940, and the Royal Air Force faces a danger at home. Spitfires drop from cloud, line up for the flare, and then betray their pilots at 30 feet. Wheels hang halfway. Pumps choke. A perfect approach becomes a cartwheel of flame. It starts at Biggin Hill just after sundown. The radio says routine recovery, the kind that should end with boots on grass and jokes in the dispersal hut. The Spitfire on final has the kind of day every pilot dreams about. 2 passes on a Heinkel, 1 clean burst on a 109 that folded its landing gear and went down trailing smoke. The pilot talks fast because he's young and still alive. Then his voice changes. Lowering gear. A beat. Another. The tower leans forward, as if that could help a mechanism conceive courage. Too green, the controller calls, keeping flatness in his tone, the way a man keeps a hand steady over a bleeding wound. Third lamp is dark. The Spitfire drifts past the field, engine humming like a promise it can't enforce. He tries again. The dead light stares back. He holds off too long, loses lift, and kisses the grass with the belly of a thoroughbred. The propeller scythes. The machine bites the turf, flips, and stamps a punctuation mark of flame against the hedgerow. McNabb runs. Everyone runs, but McNabb runs as if his legs know a path he's rehearsed in nightmares. He yanks the hatch. 2 ground crew take the pilot's shoulders, another man the boots. The stink of warm glycol and scorched paint sticks to the back of the throat. Foam, howl. Then quiet. Always that strangely polite quiet after the noise, as if the airfield itself is embarrassed. They chalk a new mark on the bulkhead. Landing lost. Another tally in a column that shouldn't exist. The squadron leader dictates a report at a desk polished by elbows and grief. Coffee rings, ash in the tray, accuracy like a knife. He writes the sentence he hates most: cause not enemy action. He lists the pattern, 1 bullet after another, extended patrols at altitude, rapid descent through cold to damp layers, gear lever actuated, pump pressure transient, actuator stall, partial extension, collapse or belly landing. The lines look tidy, which is the cruel thing about tidy lines. Pilots who outran tracers die at home, and logbooks decide whether their names stay black or turn red. Headquarters answers with a circular that reads like a sermon delivered from the other side of a closed door. A redesigned hydraulic pump is in development at Derby. Estimated lead time 6 months. Testing protocols to follow. Do not modify field units. The last line is underlined. It is always the last line that tries to be the law. In the hangar, the underlined line becomes a noise, then a joke with no laughter in it. 6 months. The sound of the phrase is wind in an empty tent. Arthur Mac McNabb keeps his opinion the way he keeps his tools, clean, sharp, and reachable. He is a mechanic of the kind that doesn't announce itself. Calloused palms, fingernails permanently lined with a memory of oil, a habit of listening before he speaks that makes people repeat themselves in case he missed something. He has no degree, no framed paper on a wall, no patience for the hierarchy of men who collect signatures like other men collect stamps. He has a good ear and a bad temper for parts that lie. After the crash, he takes a minute alone with the wreck before the recovery gang drags it away. Not reverence, exactly. Inventory. He pulls back a panel, touches the actuator body, and draws back with a small hiss because the casing is too hot for the dusk it's been cooling in. He pockets a seal ring warped into an oval like a mouth that finished a scream and forgot to close. His shed sits apart from the main hangar, a low run of tin roof that collects rain and throws it back as a steady drumming. The door sticks unless you know the thumb's width trick. Inside, a bench that bowed under a dozen wars' worth of engines, a kettle that wheezes like a happy pump, a hurricane bay hacked down to a test rig, a pressure gauge with a nick on its glass. He spreads a rag the way some men set a table and lays out the pieces. Sprayer valve poached from a farmer who prefers cash to questions. Copper tubing trimmed from a radiator that died during a previous miracle. Clamps, safety wire, a stub of schoolroom chalk that survived too many pockets. He starts with listening, because machines confess if you give them the chance. He warms the fluid with a paint stripper lamp until the metal exudes that particular lemonade tang of hot hydraulic oil. The needle climbs and settles. He taps the line. Under vibration, he works a palm sander against the rig to mimic engine shudder. The gauge flutters, then drops in a way that is not pressure, but the refusal of pressure. The pump begins to chatter, not the slam of a mechanical failure, the thin chatter of a small deceit, air in line where no air belongs. When fluid cavitates, it's not loud, it lies by omission. Micro-bubbles form anywhere seals shrug in cold or yield in heat. The pump compresses gas that gives instead of liquid that pushes. The system doesn't move what it's supposed to move. An actuator trying to lock a gear leg becomes a man pushing a door in a dream. He sketches a simple diagram with the chalk on the bench. Loop here, check valve there, bleed to return. It is plumbing, and of course that will be an insult if anyone needs one. He writes T-E-M-P on the corner of the sketch and underlines it because underlining is how men convince themselves of propriety. A demonstration at noon the next day allows no room for hope to play hide-and-seek. The station commander wants to see the fault. A careful pilot volunteers, the kind who breathes on instruments the way other men breathe on dice. The circuit is textbook, clean base, patient turn, nose steady, lever down. The pump coughs into chatter, too green. The third lamp holds its breath. He raises the gear, flies long, tries again. Same story, different sentence. In the end he kisses grass with the belly skin and slides, elegant as a failure can be, into a stop that saves the airframe and dents its pride. There's applause in the tower, the kind that means relief and not approval. McNabb is in the crash truck before the cheers die. He kneels, palms the actuator again, and smiles without humor when it bites his hand. "Hot," he says, which is a whole paragraph in his mouth. Back in the shed, he sets the kettle, lifts the chalk, and finishes the loop. He is not blind to the line he's about to cross. The maintenance law is clear. Modifying an airworthy aircraft without authorization is a shortcut to a bad room with a worse chair. Evans, the senior rigger with a face like a kind hammer, leans in the doorway and reads the bench chalk. "They'll have your stripe and your supper," he says. McNabb keeps solder flowing, feeds it into the seam, slow, so flux can do all its tiny miracles. "If we leave it alone," he says, "they'll have funerals." "You choose?" The little valve sits in his palm with the weight of a coin. He takes a center punch and taps an arrow in the metal. Flow this way, as if the hydraulics were schoolchildren who needed help finding the door. When he holds the loop in the light, the copper shows a rose glint where flame kissed it. He thinks it's a pretty thing, and then corrects himself. Pretty doesn't matter. Working matters. They fit the loop at night, because night is better at discretion. The chosen Spitfire is temperamental by reputation. Indicator bulb that sulks, pump that races to prove masculinity, and then collapses at the first real demand. Evans works the clamps. McNabb does the last turns with a spanner he trusts more than some men. Safety wire twangs and falls. He can feel the machine as if it were the shoulder of a friend. Dawn comes with a cold that makes the shed talk. Sergeant Peterhall arrives the way test pilots do when they've decided to put their bones on a scale. He has the kind of smile that looks like a straight line most of the time, and the kind of eyes that listen to the ground crew because the ground crew are the last men to touch the parts that have to love him back. No fuss. He straps in, engines up, and arcs away into a sky that looks like paper wetted for watercolor. McNabb stands with his hands in his pockets so they won't tremble. He listens to the pump by proxy, through the air and his own heartbeat. Hall calls the checks. Climb, level, lowering. The radio clicks. A small cough of electricity. Gear down. Silence. Then the sentence that starts as air and lands as relief. 3 green. Hall cycles the gear again. Up, down. Smooth motor sound. No chatter. A hum like someone who knows the song. He lands without ceremony and taxis in with the grin of a man who has just decided where to place his faith. He doesn't remove his gloves before he speaks. "What did you do?" "Gave it a place to breathe," McNabb says, and he's not sure whether he's talking about the airplane or himself. The squadron leader calls them both in as if he's choosing between promotion and arrest and finds room for neither in his morning. He's a results man in a results war, and the only result that matters is aircraft returning as aircraft, not as insurance arguments. 5 more, he says, quietly. Both men nod, as if the sentence were a prayer recited before a dangerous meal. The minutes that follow turn into a day that turns into a rhythm. Hangar doors roll, copper glints under cowls, safety wire sings, paperwork pretends to be deaf. Word slips along the coast to Manston and Kenley, where men have also grown tired of writing "no lock" in a column that feels like an accusation. A van of parts is recorded as missing and reappears later as scrap, which is to say it never left and saved time by not pretending it did. Inspectors arrive like weather that doesn't care about plans. They sniff copper and find heresy. "Unauthorized assembly," one says, as if he's naming a disease. He starts a sentence that contains sabotage and discipline. He doesn't finish it because a line of pilots in oil-streaked jackets has quietly formed behind him. There is a tone pilots keep for rare uses. It comes out now, and it means "over my dead body," and the inspector remembers he is unarmed in a place where men are armed with experience. They don't win a battle. They achieve a stalemate in which results counsel patience. A week passes with no bellies in the hedgerow. A fortnight with 2 close saves and 0 cartwheels. Mechanics discover the novel sensation of boredom at dusk. They have time to be bored because nobody is dragging wreckage. McNabb builds a checklist with his pencil, pressed into paper until the letters become small trenches. If indicator bulb fails, tap here, test there. Don't trust the lamp more than the hum. He pins the paper above the rack and reinforces the thumbtack with a dab of solder because it's there and because it turns one weak point into something that might embarrass Storms. When the official answer arrives, it wears a different hat and the same face. A typed order from the Air Ministry authorizes a temporary field adjustment to address intermittent hydraulic instability. It includes a diagram politely resembling the loop McNabb drew with chalk and a list of standardized fittings polished enough to make gentlemen nod approval at each other. Now it is lawful. Previously, it was effective. McNabb doesn't mind which hat it wears if it keeps living up to its job. Evans brings a penny and tapes it to the toolbox latch. "For luck," he says. McNabb says luck didn't help solder flow uphill, and then leaves the penny where it is because rituals belong to men who caught risk with wrenches. The chalk tally on the bulkhead stops growing. Men notice it by not noticing it, the way a fever leaves a room without anyone pointing at the thermometer. The pump casing after sorties is warm like a hand you trust, not hot like a stove that doesn't know the difference between help and harm. Nights grow a little quieter. The kettle on the bench wheezes happy again. And this is where the ground starts to give back what it took. A fix small enough to hide in a palm keeps faith with gravity. The law, having arrived late, stamps temporary in red letters at the bottom of a page. In the hangar, men use the word tomorrow without flinching. The story, properly speaking, does not end here. It begins with a mechanic under a tin roof, a copper loop the rules did not bless, and a field of aircraft that might finally land as intended, safely. Ahead stand a midnight torture test in rain so hard it becomes a curtain, a day when the Luftwaffe tries to drown the sky and fails, and a bargain struck between results and rules that will leave no medal and save many names. Now, step back from the flare path and into the machine room of the problem, into the backstory of how McNabb heard cavitation whisper where memos shouted, why a pump chattered itself into betrayal at 30 feet, and how a loop of copper taught a Spitfire to breathe when the runway demanded honesty. The night the rulebook died began with fog. It rolled across the grass like breath from a tired god, smudging the runway lights until they looked like tired eyes. The hangar lamps glowed in cones of yellow, illuminating two figures hunched over the guts of a half-stripped Spitfire. Arthur Mac McNabb held the soldering iron like a surgeon who'd run out of patience for permission. Evans, his senior rigger and reluctant accomplice, watched the clock instead of the work. "Midnight," Evans muttered. "You've officially entered heresy." "Then we're saints of a different faith," McNabb said without looking up. He guided the last ribbon of molten metal into the copper loop, sealing it with a hiss that sounded almost like relief. The tiny valve gleamed beneath the lamplight, a crude, beautiful lie built from stolen parts and sleepless conscience. They'd spent the evening stripping a spare Hurricane for tubing, hammering the kinks out on a wooden block while the air raid sirens howled in the distance. The Spitfire before them, K9993, was a cursed machine by consensus. Its gear indicators sulked. Its hydraulics hissed like a leaky kettle. Every landing was a coin toss. The squadron had started calling it Kiss Goodbye. Tonight it would become the proof or the prosecution. McNabb's hands moved without hesitation. He fitted the copper bypass into the pressure return line, the small loop designed to vent air automatically whenever heat and vibration betrayed the seals. He tightened clamps until the hose bulged slightly, then wiped the joint with a rag that smelled faintly of paraffin and tobacco. Evans watched, half fascinated, half terrified. "You know what they'll call this?" "Sabotage," McNabb said, "until it works." The rain outside intensified, tapping Morse code against the roof. McNabb stepped back and admired his handiwork, not as an artist, but as a man who'd dared gravity to blink. "Test her," he said. Evans sighed, flipped the main battery switch. The hydraulic pump whirred to life, whining like a mosquito in a glass jar. The needle on the pressure gauge climbed, steadied. McNabb pressed the actuator lever. Fluid hissed through the new loop, clean, steady, without the telltale stutter that meant cavitation. He smiled faintly. "She's breathing." Evans frowned. "And if she stops?" "Then I'll take the blame," McNabb replied. "You'll say you were asleep." At dawn, the fog still clung to the field. Sergeant Peter Hall arrived in his flight jacket, collar turned up, eyes still swollen from sleep and curiosity. The briefing was simple. Test the hydraulics in flight. He didn't know about the modification, at least not officially. "Morning, Mac," Hall said, squinting at the Spitfire. "You look like you've been up all night." "I prefer my ghosts awake," McNabb answered, handing him a checklist that didn't exist in any manual. Hall raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Minutes later, the Merlin engine caught with a cough and a roar, rolling smoke from the exhaust like a herald. The Spitfire taxied to the edge of the runway, its silver belly glinting through the mist. McNabb stood with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, pretending the cold was the reason they trembled. The aircraft leapt forward and clawed skyward. McNabb listened more than he watched. his head cocked toward the sound of hydraulics cycling beneath the engine's song. He could almost hear it through the air, the whine, the pressure, the possible failure. Then Hall's voice cracked through the radio static. "Climb stable!" Cycling gear, McNabb held his breath. "Gear down," Hall said. Silence. Then 3 green. The crew on the ground exhaled as one. The test continued. Gear up, gear down, each motion smooth, obedient, alive. Hall's voice held the kind of restrained disbelief men save for miracles. He landed 15 minutes later, rolled to a stop, and popped the canopy. His grin looked like sunlight breaking through weeks of overcast. "What did you do to her, Mac?" McNabb wiped his hands on a rag, leaving grey streaks like signatures. "Helped her remember what air's supposed to do." Word spread faster than orders could chase it. Within days, copper loops began appearing on aircraft across the squadron. At first, they were quiet whispers. Mac's fix, the Kent valve, the loop. Pilots who'd survived crash landings lined up asking for it. Crews began fitting the bypass during night shifts, claiming it was routine maintenance. Every dawn brought fewer fireballs on the horizon and fewer funerals at dusk. The brass noticed. They always did. A week later, 2 inspectors arrived from the Air Ministry. Clean boots, clipboard stiffness, and the faint perfume of bureaucracy. They found the first unauthorized loop on a Spitfire, waiting for takeoff. The younger one looked confused, the elder offended. "This isn't regulation," he said, tapping the copper tube as if it might confess. "No, sir," McNabb replied evenly. "It's effective." "That's not the same thing. It'll do until your paperwork learns to land." The younger inspector almost laughed. The older one didn't. They filed their report with words like violation and disciplinary review. But the squadron leader intercepted it. He'd seen the difference, 2 weeks without a single belly landing. He signed the report, folded it neatly, and dropped it into the incinerator. "Over my dead body," he murmured, watching the flame eat the edges. The fix spread like folklore. Mechanics at neighboring stations called by code names, pretending to ask about spare parts while really asking for measurements. A lorry of copper tubing meant for water heaters vanished from a depot and somehow turned up at RAF Kenley, misdelivered. McNabb pretended not to know anything about it, though the handwriting on the requisition form was suspiciously familiar. In every hangar from Kent to Sussex, the same rhythm took hold. Solder hissing, clamps tightening, men working not for pay or medals, but to stop the sky from eating their friends. Evans scratched a tally into the wall, each line a landing saved. Then came the scare. Late afternoon, a returning pilot reported a jolt on touchdown and a flicker on the gear indicator. McNabb froze mid-step, the blood draining from his face. If one of his loops failed, it would mean everything. Court-martial, disgrace, and worse, doubt. The aircraft taxied in perfectly fine. The pilot climbed out, puzzled but unhurt. McNabb went over every line, every fitting. He found the culprit, not the valve, but a burned-out bulb. The system had worked. The signal light hadn't. He laughed once, sharp and breathless, and fixed the lamp himself. Then he wrote a short checklist on brown paper. If the indicator fails, trust the sound, not the light. He pinned it above the tool rack with a screw instead of a tack. By the end of October, the Air Ministry could no longer pretend ignorance. Reports from multiple bases described intermittent hydraulic instability resolved by temporary field modification. The phrase became the perfect bureaucratic disguise. A circular was issued. Temporary field adjustment 42B, implement auxiliary bleed loop to stabilize hydraulic pressure under variable thermal load. No mention of McNab. No mention of the nights he and Evans soldered in the fog. But the diagram, clean, labelled, precise, was unmistakably his. Evans slapped the order on the bench and smirked. "They've stolen your sin." McNab shrugged, lighting a cigarette with hands still marked by solder burns. "Then it's official." The crime worked outside. Another Spitfire touchdown. Smooth, clean, perfect. The hydraulics hummed like something that had never been broken. McNab leaned on the doorway, watching the pilot climb out and pat the wing. For the first time in months, the airfield smelled of fuel instead of fire. The world wouldn't remember the copper loop or the night it was born. That was fine. Machines didn't need applause. They needed men stubborn enough to keep them alive when the rules failed. And in the small hours, under a roof that sang with rain, Arthur McNab cleaned his tools, poured 2 cups of tea, one for himself, one for the ghosts, and listened to the soft, steady hum of a Spitfire hydraulic pump cycling through the dark. The sound was perfect. It was the sound of defiance doing its job. The rain came sideways that night, needles of water driven by wind, sharp enough to cut the dark. The tin roof of McNab's shed rattled like an empty drum. Every few seconds, lightning flashed over the field, painting the line of Spitfires in ghostly white and shadowing the men who kept them alive. McNab stood at the bench, his sleeves rolled, copper shavings glittering against the oil on his forearms. On the work table sat a battered pressure gauge, a cup of black tea gone cold, and a spare valve engraved with the faint arrow he always punched into the metal. Flow, arrow, hope. The war was shifting. The Luftwaffe had begun night raids, and Biggin Hill had become less an airfield than a scar that refused to close. Yet, amid the smoke and fatigue, a strange calm had settled. For weeks, not a single Spitfire had failed its landing. The illegal fix had outlasted its name. Still, McNab wanted proof. Not rumors, not luck, but numbers. Tonight, he intended to get them. "Storm's bad luck," Evans muttered, hunched against the wind. "It's perfect," McNab said, pulling the tarp off a crippled Spitfire marked for scrap. "If she can hold under this, she can hold under anything." The aircraft was a patchwork of battle repairs. Bullet holes stitched with rivets, a new wing root that still smelled of primer. Its name, stenciled half-faded under the cockpit, Faithless. Sergeant Peter Hall appeared out of the rain, flight suit soaked through. "You sure about this, Mac?" "Never been sure of anything that mattered," McNab said. The plan was simple. Test the valve to destruction. Push the system through every gear cycle until it either held or broke. If it failed, they'd fail privately. If it held, well, maybe the world would never need to know what law they broke to make it possible. The Merlin engine roared to life, a guttural sound swallowed by the storm. Hall taxied down the slick runway, lifted off, and vanished into the rain curtain. McNab stood alone in the downwash, face wet, eyes closed, listening, not to thunder, but to rhythm, the rhythm of hydraulics breathing. "Gear up!" Hall's voice crackled over the radio. McNab waited. Then, faintly through static, "Smooth!" "Cycle again." Up, down, pressure steady, no chatter, they kept at it. 10 cycles. 20. The pump casing warmed but never boiled. The gauge McNab held under a poncho pulsed like a heartbeat, steady, alive. Hall's laughter bled through the static. "You've just saved more men than you'll ever meet." McNab didn't answer. He just watched the sky where the Spitfire was a sound instead of a shape, and thought that maybe the sky had finally forgiven the ground. When Hall landed, rain plastered his hair flat, and he grinned the grin of a man who'd survived his own courage. McNab only nodded, as if approval might cheapen the miracle. The next morning broke grey and tense. Orders came before breakfast. The Luftwaffe was massing again across the channel. The phrase "maximum effort" went out over the radio network, a phrase every pilot knew meant everything we've got. By noon, the southern fields boiled with motion. Spitfires lined the taxiways, wings glinting with dew and determination. Ground crews moved like clockwork, their hands fast, eyes hollow. McNab's fingers were black with grease when the first wave lifted off. Evans handed him a cigarette, lit from the last of the matchbox. Neither smoked. They just needed something to hold that wasn't dread. Hours passed in a carousel of sound, engines rising and falling, radio bursts, distant thunder that wasn't weather. Every few minutes, another aircraft limped back, riddled but whole. Landing gears came down smooth, hydraulics whispering the quiet rhythm that had become their signature. No stalls, no collapses, no fireballs. By sunset, the field was littered with exhausted men, oil, and the silence of survival. The squadron leader walked the line of aircraft, touching each nose like a priest giving benediction. He found McNab leaning against a wheel strut, eyes closed. They all came home. The leader said softly. McNab looked up. Then the fix holds. It holds, the leader confirmed. And so does my faith in disobedience. They both laughed, a dry, half-choked sound that meant everything and nothing. Of course, success attracts notice. Within a week, another inspection team arrived from London, this time carrying threat more than clipboard. The lead inspector, a colonel with paper-colored hands, waved a memorandum. You are hereby ordered to remove all unauthorized hydraulic modifications. Immediate effect. The hangar went still. Pilots and riggers looked up from their work, waiting for McNab to answer. He didn't raise his voice. If you want to remove them, sir, bring your own tools. The colonel flushed. You're under military jurisdiction, mechanic. That's insubordination. Call it what you like, McNab said, wiping his hands on a rag. But every aircraft that's landed since October still has 3 green lights. You take that away, and you'll have blood on your paperwork. The colonel left with fury and embarrassment, fighting for space in his throat. A week later, the same office issued a new directive. Approved temporary kit, hydraulic stabilization loop, Type 42B, to be fitted across all operational aircraft. Same design, same function, new name. Evans pinned the memo to the wall beside the old chalk tallies. Looks like your crime's been promoted. McNab smirked. That's the Air Ministry for you. Never wrong, just late. He opened the drawer of his bench and placed his original copper valve inside, the one he'd soldered by hand under curfew. The loop still bore the faint scorch from the night of its birth. He closed the drawer gently, as if tucking in a child. Winter came. Snow softened the airfield, muffling the world to the hush of boots and engines. The landing logs told their own quiet story. Failures down by more than half, crashes rarer than peace. No one talked about the fix anymore. It had become invisible, like oxygen. In the evenings, McNab stayed late in the hangar, polishing tools, cataloguing spares, tracing the grooves in his wrench set. The war would move on to new machines, new problems, but he knew the pattern would stay the same. Some small piece of metal, some quiet act of defiance, saving lives that never knew his name. Years later, long after the guns fell silent, historians combed the archives looking for the engineer who'd solved the Spitfire's hydraulic curse. They found no patent, no award, just a note in the back of an old maintenance ledger. Modification applied by McNab without authorization. Successful, that was all. No date, no signature, just success. McNab died in 1978, a year when nobody built airplanes with copper anymore. His small cottage near Kent went up for auction, and a museum curator sorting through his shed found a battered RAF toolbox beneath a tarp. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, lay a single valve. Hand engraved into its side were 3 words scratched by a screwdriver tip: "Better fixed than fallen." The curator placed it in a glass case, label uncertain, origin unknown, field modification, circa 1940. But the few surviving mechanics who visited knew better. They leaned close to the glass, smiled at the faint arrow mark on the metal, and said the same thing every time: "Max Loop." Still saving us from gravity outside, rain tapped against the museum roof. Steady, familiar, relentless. The sound might as well have been applause. And if you listen closely, you can still hear that rhythm, the hum of copper, the breath of pressure, the heartbeat of a machine that refused to quit. The war may have ended, but McNabb's fix never did. So remember, the next time you hear the story of aces and victories, spare a thought for the hands that kept them flying, for the grease-stained heroes who broke rules to mend the sky. If this story moved you, like, comment, and share to keep Arthur McNabb's courage alive. Subscribe for more untold stories of ordinary people who fixed history, one wrench turn at a time.